The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind by Gustave Le Bon. Still in Book 3, The Classification and Description of the Different Kinds of Crowds. Chapter 3, Criminal Juries. There is a short table of contents. Criminal juries. General characteristics of juries. Statistics show that their decisions are independent of their composition. The manner in which an impression may be made on juries. The style and influence of argument, the methods of persuasion of celebrated counsel, the nature of those crimes for which juries are respectively indulgent or severe, the utility of the jury as an institution and the danger that would result from its place being taken by magistrates. Being unable to study here every category of jury, I shall only examine the most important, that of the juries of the Court of Assize. These juries afford an excellent example of the heterogeneous crowd that is not anonymous. We shall find them displayed suggestibility and but slight capacity for reasoning, while they are open to the influence of the leaders of crowds, and they are guided in the main by unconscious sentiments. In the course of this investigation we shall have occasion to observe some interesting examples of the errors that may be made by persons not versed in the psychology of crowds. Juries, in the first place, furnish us a good example of the slight importance of the mental level of the different elements composing a crowd, so far as the decisions it comes to are concerned. We have seen that when a deliberative assembly is called upon to give its opinion on a question of a character not entirely technical, intelligence stands for nothing. For instance, a gathering of scientific men or of artists, owing to the mere fact that they form an assemblage, will not deliver judgments on general subjects sensibly different from those rendered by a gathering of masons or grocers. At various periods, and in particular previous to 1848, the French administration instituted a careful choice among the persons summoned to form a jury, picking the jurors from among the enlightened classes, choosing professors, functionaries, men of letters, etc. At the present day, jurors are recruited for the most part from among small tradesmen, petty capitalists, and employees. Yet, to the great astonishment of specialist writers, whatever the composition of the jury has been, its decisions have been identical. Even the magistrates, hostile as they are to the institution of the jury, have had to recognize the exactness of the assertion. M. Bérard de Glajeux, a former president of the Court of Assize, expresses himself on the subject in his memoirs in the following terms, quote, "The selection of jurymen is today in reality in the hands of the municipal councillors, who put people down on the list or eliminate them from it in accordance with the political and electoral preoccupations inherent in their situation. The majority of the jurors chosen are persons engaged in trade, but persons of less importance than formerly, and employés belonging to certain branches of the administration. Both opinions and professions count for nothing, once the role of judge assumed, many of the jurymen having the ardor of neophytes, and men of the best intentions being similarly disposed in humble situations, the spirit of the jury has not changed. Its verdicts have remained the same." End quote. Of the passage just cited, the conclusions, which are just, are to be borne in mind and not the explanations, which are weak. Too much astonishment should not be felt at the weakness, for, as a rule, counsel equally with magistrates seems to be ignorant of the psychology of crowds, and, in consequence, of juries. I find a proof of this statement in a fact related by the author just quoted. He remarks that Lachaud, one of the most illustrious barristers practicing in the Court of Assize, made systematic use of his right to object to a juror in the case of all individuals of intelligence on the list. Yet experience, and experience alone, has ended by acquainting us with the utter uselessness of these objections. This is proved by the fact that at the present day, public prosecutors and barristers, at any rate those belonging to the Parisian bar, have entirely renounced their right to object to a juror. Still, as M. de Glajeux remarks, the verdicts have not changed. They are neither better nor worse. Like all crowds, juries are very strongly impressed by sentimental considerations, and very slightly by argument. "They cannot resist the sight," writes a barrister, "of a mother giving its child the breast or of orphans. It is sufficient that a woman should be of agreeable appearance," says M. de Glajeux, "to win the benevolence of the jury." Without pity for crimes of which it appears possible they might themselves be the victims, such crimes, moreover, are the most dangerous for society. Juries, on the contrary, are very indulgent in the case of breaches of the law, whose motive is passion. They are rarely severe on infanticide by girl mothers or hard on the young woman who throws vitriol at the man who has seduced and deserted her, for the reason that they feel instinctively that society runs but slight danger from such crimes, and that in a country in which the law does not protect deserted girls, the crime of the girl who avenges herself is rather useful than harmful, inasmuch as it frightens seducers in advance. Footnote. It is to be remarked in passing that this division of crimes into those dangerous and those not dangerous for society, which is well and instinctively made by juries, is far from being unjust. The object of criminal laws is evidently to protect society against dangerous criminals, and not to avenge it. On the other hand, the French code, and above all the minds of the French magistrates, are still deeply imbued with a spirit of vengeance characteristic of the old primitive law, and the term vindicate, prosecution from the Latin vindicta, vengeance, is still in daily use. A proof of this tendency on the part of the magistrates is found in the refusal by many of them to apply Béranger's law, which allows of a condemned person not undergoing his sentence unless he repeats his crime. Yet no magistrate can be ignorant, for the fact is proved by statistics that the application of a punishment inflicted for the first time infallibly leads to further crime on the part of the person punished. When judges set free a sentenced person, it always seems to them that society has not been avenged. Rather than not avenge it, they prefer to create a dangerous, confirmed criminal. End footnote. Juries, like all crowds, are profoundly impressed by prestige, and President Desglajeaux very properly remarks that, very democratic as juries are in their composition, they are very aristocratic in their likes and dislikes. Name, birth, great wealth, celebrity, the assistance of an illustrious counsel, everything in the nature of distinction or that lends brilliancy to the accused, stands him in extremely good stead. The chief concern of a good counsel should be to work upon the feelings of the jury, and, as with all crowds, to argue but little, or only to employ rudimentary modes of reasoning. An English barrister, famous for his successes in the assize courts, has well set forth the line of action to be followed. Quote, while pleading, he would attentively observe the jury. The most favorable opportunity has been reached. By dint of insight and experience, the counsel reads the effect of each phrase on the faces of the jurymen, and draws his conclusions in consequence. His first step is to be sure which members of the jury are already favorable to his cause. It is short work to definitely gain their adhesion, and having done so he turns his attention to the members who seem, on the contrary, ill-disposed, and endeavours to discover why they are hostile to the accused. This is the delicate part of his task, for there may be an infinity of reasons for condemning a man apart from the sentiment of justice. End quote. These few lines resume the entire mechanism of the art of oratory, and we see why the speech prepared in advance has so slight an effect, it being necessary to be able to modify the terms employed from moment to moment in accordance with the impression produced. The orator does not require to convert to his views all the members of a jury, but only the leading spirits among it, who will determine the general opinion. As in all crowds, so in juries there are a small number of individuals who serve as guides to the rest. I have found by experience, says the counsel cited above, that 1 or 2 energetic men suffice to carry the rest of the jury with them. It is those 2 or 3 whom it is necessary to convince by skilful suggestions. First of all, and above all, it is necessary to please them. The man forming part of a crowd whom one has succeeded in pleasing is on the point of being convinced, and is quite disposed to accept as excellent any arguments that may be offered him. I detach the following anecdote from an interesting account of Monsieur Lachaud, alluded to above. Quote, it is well known that during all the speeches he would deliver in the course of an assize sessions, Lachaud never lost sight of the 2 or 3 jurymen whom he knew or felt to be influential but obstinate. As a rule, he was successful in winning over these refractory jurors. On one occasion, however, in the provinces, he had to deal with a juryman whom he plied in vain for 3/4 of an hour with his most cunning arguments. The man was the 7th juryman, the first on the second bench. The case was desperate. Suddenly, in the middle of a passionate demonstration, Lachaud stopped short, and addressing the president of the court, said, would you give instructions for the curtain there in front to be drawn? The 7th juryman is blinded by the sun. The juryman in question reddened, smiled, and expressed his thanks. He was won over for the defense. End quote. Many writers, some of them most distinguished, have started of late of late, a strong campaign against the institution of the jury, although it is the only protection we have against the errors of really very frequent of a caste that is under no control. Footnote. The magistracy is, in point of fact, the only administration whose acts are under no control. In spite of all of its revolutions, democratic France does not possess that right of habeas corpus of which England is so proud. We have banished all the tyrants, but have set up a magistrate in each city who disposes at will of the honor and liberty of the citizens, an insignificant juge d'instruction, an examining magistrate who has no exact counterpart in England. From the translator. Fresh from the university, possesses the revolting power of sending to prison at will persons of the most considerable standing on a simple supposition on his part of their guilt, and without being obliged to justify his act to anyone. Under the pretext of pursuing his investigation, he can keep these persons in prison for 6 months or even a year, and free them at last without owing them either an indemnity or excuses. The warrant in France is the exact equivalent of the lettre de cachet, with this difference, that the latter, with the use of which the monarchy was so justly reproached, could only be resorted to by persons occupying a very high position, while the warrant is an instrument in the hands of a whole class of citizens, which is far from passing for being very enlightened or very independent. End footnote. A portion of these writers advocated jury recruited solely from the ranks of the enlightened classes, but we have already proved that even in this case the verdicts would be identical with those returned under the present system. Other writers, taking their stand on the errors committed by juries, would abolish the jury and replace it by judges. It is difficult to see how these would-be reformers can forget that the errors for which the jury is blamed were committed in the first instance by judges, and that when the accused person comes before a jury he has already been held to be guilty by several magistrates, by the juge d'instruction, the public prosecutor, and the court of arraignment. It should thus be clear that were the accused to be definitely judged by magistrates instead of by jurymen, he would lose his only chance of being admitted innocent. The errors of juries have always been the first of all the errors of magistrates. It is solely the magistrates, then, who should be blamed when particularly monstrous judicial errors crop up, such, for instance, as the quite recent condemnation of Dr. L., who, prosecuted by a juge d'instruction of excessive stupidity on the strength of the denunciation of a half-idiot girl who accused the doctor of having performed an illegal operation upon her for 30 francs, which would have been sent to penal servitude but for an explosion of public indignation, which had for result that he was immediately set at liberty by the chief of state. The honorable character given the condemned man by all his fellow citizens made the grossness of the blunder self-evident. The magistrates themselves admitted it, and yet out of caste considerations they did all they could to prevent the pardon being signed. In all similar affairs the jury, confronted with technical details it is unable to understand, naturally hearkens to the public prosecutor, arguing that, after all, the affair has been investigated by magistrates trained to unravel the most intricate situations. Who then are the real authors of the error, the jury or the magistrates? We should cling vigorously to the jury. It constitutes perhaps the only category of crowd that cannot be replaced by any individuality. It alone can temper the severity of the law, which, equal for all, ought in principle to be blind and to take no cognizance of particular cases. Inaccessible to pity and heeding nothing but the text of the law, the judge in his professional severity would visit with the same penalty the burglar guilty of murder and the wretched girl whom poverty and her abandonment by her seducer have driven to infanticide. The jury, on the other hand, instinctively feels that the seduced girl is much less guilty than the seducer, who, however, is not touched by the law, and that she deserves every indulgence. Being well acquainted of the psychology of castes, and also with the psychology of other categories of crowds, I do not perceive a single case in which, wrongly accused of a crime, I should not prefer to have to deal with a jury rather than magistrates. I should have some chance that my innocence would be recognized by the former, and not the slightest chance that it would be admitted by the latter. The power of crowds is to be dreaded, but the power of certain castes is to be dreaded yet more. Crowds are open to conviction. Castes never are. That is the end of Chapter 3, Criminal Juries. Continue next time with Chapter 4, Electoral Crowds.